So my presentation is going to be a little bit more on the academic. I hope you like PowerPoint. And also, I'm going to be going into different evolutionary theories of anxiety and presenting a lot of data. So it's going to be that type of presentation. So I'm just forewarning you in case you were looking for something a little bit more hands-on. This is going to be a little bit more theoretical. Just by way of introduction, my name is Eddie Sturman. I'm one of the psychology professors at the branch campus in Queensbury, and love working with all the people there. And I think that's about it. I should also mention, I cut out this, the title of this was The Evolutionary Basis of Anxiety and the Buffering Effects of the Human Will. And so I was going to present on two areas of research, but as I was putting it together, I realized they don't really fit together. So at the end, I'll go into a little bit about some of the research I've been doing on the human will, just as a sort of an addendum. But the main focus is just going to be on evolutionary theories, specifically social rank theory and attachment theory, and how those can account for anxiety. So anxiety prepares us for upcoming challenges or threats, according to evolutionary theorists. So that is really the function of anxiety, according to evolutionary psychology. You can almost think of it in terms of any kind of challenge you have. So for instance, students who have a test coming up, if they don't have a sufficient level of anxiety, they're not going to bother putting in the work. And they're probably not going to do well. So anxiety has a very kind of specific function, according to evolutionary theorists, and it would have provided clear selective advantages to those possessing the trait. In other words, people who worried more were more likely to survive and therefore pass on their genes to future generations. Just making was that individuals who worried would have survived to a greater extent and then pass that trait on to offspring, and over many generations, all humans would come to possess this trait, right? And that's basically how natural selection works. But I think the key point here is that anxiety, even though it feels bad, just like depression and certain other mood states or affect feeling states, is actually adaptive, and so we need it in order to survive. Another kind of evolutionary take on anxiety is the smoke detector principle, which is just arguing that we should always err on the side of anxiety. Failure to do so could lead to major costs, like death. So the smoke detector may go off fairly frequently, but the one time you decide not to pay attention to it, you could have a major disaster. And so that's the smoke detector principle, that all things being equal, we should err on the side of anxiety. And there's some support for this. So studies show that people with low levels of anxiety actually have lower long-term survival rates. But of course there's limits. So, if you were just nervous Nelly all the time, then you wouldn't be devoting energy to pursuing other objectives like acquiring resources and mates. So although as a species we kind of err towards anxiety, there's a limit to that. At a certain point, it becomes maladaptive. And especially when you get to like levels of extreme anxiety, like you see in anxiety disorders, that's clearly maladaptive. All right, so most group living species establish a hierarchical system based on social rank, and status within those hierarchies has major reproductive implications. Humans are no different. Almost every human organization has some kind of a hierarchy, and it does have major reproductive implications, particularly for males. In most mammalian species, males who have higher status have more reproductive opportunities. So they have usually their pick of a mate, food preference for food and other resources. And so status has big payoffs, particularly for males. And humans, it's more or less the same thing. Losing in dominance contests, according to social rank theorists, activates what's called the involuntary subordinate strategy. And I always thought this was a really neat idea. What interested me in all of this was that I had started out in clinical psychology, but I always had an interest in evolutionary theory. I liked evolutionary theory because it kind of gets at ultimate questions. Why do we have anxiety? Why are we depressed? So what function do these various emotional states serve? And so I like that kind of broader perspective. And so this was a way to kind of combine my interests. And so I'd been reading through some of these social rank theorists, and they were putting forward these different mechanisms that existed in animal species that would relate to depression. And so the involuntary subordinate strategy is thought to be an unconscious defense strategy that protects the loser in agonistic encounters from injury, which just means that at a certain point in a dominance contest, one of the competitors will, once it's like the writing is on the wall that they're going to lose, will kind of completely disengage, shut down, and signal that they're out of the contest. And that's actually adaptive, because if it's trusted to be genuine, then the eventual victor will leave that individual alone, and so they'll be protected, right? They won't come to further harm. And so it's really a self-protection strategy, this involuntary subordinate strategy. And once they've lost, this mechanism kind of switches off and life goes back to normal. They may have to accept a lower position, but life more or less goes back to normal. So that's the involuntary subordinate strategy. Sheldrake, I never know if I'm pronouncing that correct. He was actually the person to come up with the term pecking order. Defeated hen, as such, deeply depressed in spirit, humble with drooping wings and head in the dust, it is in any rate on being vanquished, overcome with paralysis, even though one cannot detect any sign of physical injury. And so this very much describes like the involuntarily subordinate state. And it may be accused of being a little bit anthropomorphic, meaning we're kind of imbuing these hens with human qualities, but I trust his observations in this case. And so other authors then went on to liken this kind of this subordinate state with human depression. So social rank theory, sometimes called the social competition hypothesis, was developed by John Price, Leon Sloman, Paul Gilbert. They've all done a lot of work on this over the years. I've had the pleasure of working with Leon Sloman. He's in his 90s and he's still doing research. We're working on a paper, so he's kind of my hero. But they would say that the ISS, or involuntary subordinate strategy, has physiological, behavioral, and cognitive elements, all of which are geared towards de-escalating competitive endeavors and protecting the individual from injury. So that's the main function of the ISS. So it's very much like a lying low strategy. And we see this, like I have the example here of a sports team that's losing. You see in terms of the behavioral impact of defeat, you see people kind of slouched over, drooped over, grown men crying. We also know there's physiological changes going on. So there's a decrease in testosterone, lower serotonin activity, dopamine, etc. And also, where did I lose? Oh, and then psychological changes. You're kind of more in a giving up mindset. So that's the first point. And again, it's all like a kind of self-protective strategy. And then when the individual has been able to escape the arena or accepted a new rank, the ISS is terminated. And so it's actually a very adaptive mechanism. The problem is when somebody is stuck in a losing situation, this is sometimes called entrapment, or can't accept defeat, the ISS becomes prolonged. And at that point, it's no longer adaptive. It may actually manifest as major depression or anxiety. And we also see that the defeat and victory in humans, right? Like, so I was describing the hens, but we see the same reactions in human beings. And with us, there's many domains of defeat and victory. It's not just these kind of agonistic dominance contests, but you'll see. I'd mentioned sport. Obviously, there's winning and losing. At work, right? You could be demoted or you could be promoted. Love, certainly you could be rejected, or you could find love, and in the social arena as well. So we see, and the interesting thing is, no matter what the arena, the reactions, the physiological reactions, the behavioral reactions, the psychological reactions to being defeated are more or less the same. As far as social rank and social anxiety go, Gilbert, and because I know this is an anxiety conference, and this theory is sometimes more used to account for depression, but it also can account for social anxiety. And that's why I like it, because we know from studies that depression and social anxiety, or just in anxiety in general, go hand in hand. And so why is that? The literature doesn't have much to say on that, except this theory can account for that, connection between those. And so Gilbert and Trower argued that people who have been defeated and are involuntarily subordinate should have a heightened awareness of more powerful others, as they do not wish to incur further losses. So this is really accounting for social anxiety, because individuals who are socially anxious tend to view others as more powerful. And they're kind of more fearful of others, more ready to submit. Those are really the hallmarks of social anxiety. And so a part of that has to do with your kind of perceived status, right? And that's how it connects with social rank theory. Humans perceiving themselves as lower status or defeated express submissive behaviors like gaze aversion, fear grinning to a greater extent. And Gilbert also found that lower status was related to social anxiety or phobia and feelings of shame. So as far as social anxiety and social phobia, you might ask, what's the difference? I think currently in the DSM-5, it's just social phobia, but historically, social phobia is the fear of being observed and judged while performing a task in public. And social anxiety is feelings of extreme nervousness and self-consciousness in social situations. So historically, there's been a bit of a distinction between those two. So like I say, I was really interested in this theory, and I kind of want about trying to test it. So that's where I sort of have come into the picture over the years, is developing tools to go out and actually try and empirically test various aspects of the theory. So the very first thing, well, not the first thing, I had looked at it in different ways before, but back in 2011, I developed this involuntary subordination questionnaire, because there was really no tool for getting at involuntary subordination that was out there. Gilbert had developed measures of defeat, submissive behavior, or superior to others, and then entrapment, feeling stuck or trapped, but no questionnaire specifically related to involuntary subordination. And in one study, I found that all of those things, like conducted a factor analysis, and found that all of them loaded on one factor, which I interpreted as involuntary subordination. So people who are in an involuntarily subordinate state are feeling defeated, they're more likely to act submissively, and they feel inferior to others, and they also feel stuck or trapped in that state. And so, developed that new questionnaire based on that, based on all those other variables, and administered it to 119 undergraduate college students, along with measures of depressive symptoms, because again, involuntary subordination should be correlated with depression, and it should also be related to social anxiety and phobia. And I assessed them all at 2 time points, so at baseline and then 9 weeks later, so time 2. And these are some of the results I got. And you can see involuntary subordination. If you haven't taken stats in a while, those correlations are pretty strong. especially the correlation with baseline depressive symptoms. And they're all positive correlations, meaning that as involuntary subordination increased, so did depressive symptoms, so did social anxiety, so did social phobia. And that was at baseline and at time 2. So how they scored on involuntary subordination at time 1, or at predicted how socially anxious, socially phobic, and depressed they were 9 weeks later. And it was also able to predict changes in social anxiety over the course of 9 weeks. So how you scored on involuntary subordination at time 1 accounted for changes in social anxiety over that course of time. So what are the implications? The psychological aspect of involuntary subordination may include a sense of, like I said, being defeated, inferior, stuck, and submissive. And like I say, it was significantly related to both social anxiety and social phobia at both time points, and predict change in social anxiety over 9 weeks. So that's the involuntary subordinate strategy. And it's mostly dealing with these kind of negative affective states like depression, anxiety, and so on. But Leon Sloman and I, did some work on the flip side of that, which we called the involuntary winning strategy. In this case, when you're winning, this mechanism would kick in, and it's really triggered by that kind of success experience and leads to feelings of euphoria and confidence. And that confidence in turn gives you kind of higher self-efficacy, a higher belief that you're going to be kind of confident in your future endeavors. It's accompanied by neurochemical and hormonal changes. So specifically, you would have, after a win, you would have kind of increased serotonin, dopamine activity. As far as hormones, we know that following victory, we experience higher testosterone levels. And actually, there's a hypothesis out there that those higher testosterone levels actually prepare you for future challenges. That's the function of that. But we do clearly see it even when people are watching their favorite sports teams. If they win, we see this spike in testosterone levels. And the whole idea here is that success begets success. So because of that, those feelings of mastery that come with success experiences, because of those kind of neurochemical and hormonal changes, we're more likely to then win again in the future or be successful in the future. And this is Leon's kind of graph of this. And he likes cycles. And so you can see there's the contest. If you're losing, that leads to this kind of maladaptive cycle where you have entrapment and continuing loss, mounting frustration, a prolonged IDS, hopelessness, self-criticism, shame, and then clinical depression. But if you're losing and you can kind of accept the defeat, or you can escape the arena, then the IDS is terminated and life sort of goes back to normal. And then here you can see the winning, after winning, individuals would enter into this kind of adaptive cycle where instead of dysphoria or sadness, they're experiencing euphoric feelings, increased confidence, feelings of mastery, persistent IWS, and then continued success. And so you enter into this kind of adaptive cycle where success begets success. So the second study that I'm going to just go over looked at victory, defeat, acceptance, and their relation to anxiety. So I had developed this involuntary subordination questionnaire to get at involuntary subordination, but I also wanted to try and measure real world defeat and victory. And so, victory, so kind of getting at both the involuntary subordinate strategy and the involuntary winning strategy, and in relation to real world kind of victory and defeat that people had experienced. And if they were defeated, to what extent could they accept that and move on? Because again, going back to this graph, if you can accept that defeat, then the IDS should theoretically terminate. And so the research studies research goals in question, like I said, wanted to measure real world victory and defeat. The previous study had looked at social anxiety and social phobia, but how would victory and defeat relate to generalized anxiety, which we can think of as like excessive worry? Also perceived stress, life satisfaction, and then in line with that social rank theory, would acceptance of real world defeat lead to lower levels of anxiety? So if people could accept their losses, would they be less anxious, less depressed, and so on? And so here was the scale. I modified an existing life events scale. With life events measures, and then they'll ask you to rate how stressed you are as a result of those. But I thought how victorious or defeated you felt as a result of those may actually be more important than the subjective stress you felt in relation to those things. So here's just a few of the items, 31, 32, and 33. So you can see major change in financial status, major change in closeness of family members, increased or decreased closeness, gaining a new family member, right? And I didn't a priori decide which events would be considered defeated, like defeating or victory inspiring. I let people decide for themselves. And so they had to rate to what extent those things happened in the last 8 weeks. So first of all, if they hadn't happened, they would just leave it blank. But if they had experienced that event in the last 8 weeks, they would rate the extent to which they felt defeated or victorious as a result of it, and the extent to which if they were defeated because of it, the extent to which they were able to move on and accept it. And so that formed the defeat, victory, and acceptance scale. And it was tested on 106 undergrad students, along with measures of generalized anxiety, perceived stress, and satisfaction with life. And so the results I got from that was that real world defeat or victory was related to generalized anxiety, higher levels of stress, and life satisfaction. So in other words, people who had more defeating events in the past 8 weeks were more likely to be anxious, more stressed, and more dissatisfied with life. But you can look at the flip side of that. If you want to be more optimistic, people who were victorious or who felt victorious as a result of all these different life events were less likely to be anxious, experienced less stress, and greater satisfaction with life. And I mean, that stands to reason. I was also interested in acceptance of defeat, as I said, and that was related to generalized anxiety as well. So we had a significant negative correlation there. So the higher your acceptance of defeat, the lower your levels of generalized anxiety, and also lower your levels of perceived stress, but it wasn't significantly related to life satisfaction. So in other words, people who accepted defeating events and moved on were less anxious and less stressed. It's kind of like, is that the Lord's Prayer or something? Give me, I don't know, the strength to, I guess I can't remember it exactly, but I think a key component of it is being able to kind of accept things and not worry about things you can't change. And so, yeah. So those are the first two studies that I thought that related to anxiety. So these kind of evolutionary explanations for anxiety. And those really hinged on the social rank system. But another kind of major theory in evolutionary psychology is attachment theory. And between the two of those theories, they really account for a wide gamut of human experience, love and status. And Bowlby was the first to develop attachment theory. He argued that attachment bonds function to maintain proximity between the mother and child, and the mother becomes a kind of secure base for the child to explore his or her world. Ainsworth then conducted a study, showed that people have different attachment styles. And I won't go into it more. I have 5 minutes. So I'll try to get through these as quickly as possible. But attachment styles developed in childhood also persist into adulthood. They form the basis for our adult relationships. And Bartholomew and Horowitz developed a model based on how we perceive ourselves in relationships and how we view others. And you have securely attached individuals who view the self and others in a positive fashion. They have high self-worth and expect others to be accepting. I'll skip the rest, but I'll also focus on, except for fearful avoiding, who see themselves and others negatively. They avoid close relationships so as to prevent rejection. And so then Sloman has also looked at the intersection of the attachment and social rank systems. How do they relate to one another? And Sloman said, you know, if one suffers a serious defeat but receives reassurance and support from someone towards whom one is securely attached, that reaffirms their ability to elicit positive resources from the environment, bolsters one's self-confidence, reduces one's level of anxiety. So secure attachment is related to kind of lower levels of anxiety, facilitates acceptance of defeat, which allows one to move on rather than being embroiled in a conflict or struggle for status with no chance of prevailing. However, if a child is fearful of their parent or their parent is neglectful, not only will they fail to learn how to regulate their affect, but will struggle to cope with setbacks and defeats later in life. And so I thought to put this to the test and hypothesize that a secure attachment style would be related to greater acceptance of defeat, which would in turn predict lower involuntary subordination and ultimately depression. In contrast, people with a fearful attachment style would be related to less acceptance of defeat, and then that would predict higher involuntary subordination and depression, and tested that out in 106 undergraduate students. And these were the results. So all of these numbers that you see here, these are all significant, what we'd call path coefficients. But you can see on the one side with securely attached individuals, they're more likely to be able to accept defeat. That secure attachment was also negatively related to involuntary subordination. So securely attached people were less likely to be involuntarily subordinate. The acceptance of defeat was negatively related to involuntary. So if you accepted defeat, you were less likely to be involuntarily subordinate. And of course, involuntary subordination was related to depression. And with the fear on the other side of this graph here, people who had that fearful attachment were less likely to accept defeat. Then that in turn predicted involuntary subordination and depression. And also those people who are fearfully attached were just more likely to be involuntarily subordinate and therefore depressed.